Hey, folks, welcome to another edition of the Mental Health Podcast. I have Nina here with me, uh, and I can't wait for you guys to hear for what she has to say. Hey, Nina, how are things with you today?
Hi, Sanjay. Good morning.
Good morning. The first thing that I ask people is to talk a little bit about themselves so people can understand where you're coming from and get a perspective on your own journey as well. So here you go. The floor is all yours.
Oh, okay. Well, my name is Nina, and
Mm-hmm.
I am well, I'll just start by saying this, like being a therapist, it's hard to talk about myself. So it's kind of a struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I did my own little versions of avoidance by kind of pushing this off for a little while, but I think that there's a lot of things that you and I have talked about that I think that would be helpful maybe for other people.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll start by saying that. But I am a licensed marriage family therapist in the state of California.
Mm-hmm.
And presently I'm in private practice.
Mm-hmm.
And my private practice is called Strom's Nomad Therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So I do a lot of, it's very client centered, and there's definitely, I do some contracts with other companies, but my journey up until this point has been really unfolding, and a lot
Mm-hmm.
as of
Mm-hmm.
recent as well. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll start by saying that because being a therapist and talking about myself is really difficult.
Okay.
So
Okay.
yeah.
Definitely. I mean, I think from the standpoint that I come in from, I found it a lot more easier when I've had to ask questions rather than answer questions because talking about mental health and my own personal mental health is a challenge for me as well. So let me start with the basics, right? What does mental health mean to you? Can we just get started with that? So.
Okay. Well, I love that. Because as you know me, and I know you, I think it really is unique to each person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the motivators, it really, it could be a lot of different things, but I mean, I think it's the thing that grounds you and the thing that allows you to create space to have a clear picture of what you have going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's, a lot of times we get like, oh, mental wellness is these categories, like all these categories of your work life and your home life and your
Mm-hmm.
relationship, your
Mm-hmm.
finances,
Mm-hmm.
should all
Mm-hmm.
be here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it feels sometimes very linear, but I really think it's how you define it. It's kind of that question of also like, how do you
Mm-hmm.
define success?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But it looks different for each person, and I think that it's not a destination that you reach, but it's a constant unfolding that you're doing your whole
Mm-hmm.
life.
Definitely. I love that idea wherein like mental health isn't something that you define. It is something that's a unique journey and everybody has their own path and it unfolds along the way. Um, you know, one thing that I have had my own personal struggles, but I'm trying to get different perspectives on individual journeys, right? Can you talk a little bit about your own personal mental health journey and like where you're at right now as well? So yeah.
Okay, absolutely. And I just have to say to your viewers, Sanjay, because we are on a video, but they won't be, but you have this really cute fake cat in your background that's super distracting to me. Okay. All right, everybody, let's focus. All right. Well, That's a great question, because something I did want to really say about my own mental health journey and the mental health journey of many is that our the person that your therapist is, like if you do therapy, the person that your therapist is
Mhm,
just another human being.
mhm,
And they have their lens and their experiences in which they come to the world. And we never know what anyone else's, experiences, or what their battles are, or what, even what their experience, how their experience affects how they see the world. Like, we don't know any of that stuff. Even when they
mhm,
tell us,
mhm,
that's still that's still kind of up in the air. Like, that's just such an unknown thing, which is kind of
mhm,
cool if you think about it. Like, it's like knowing that no matter what experience we're having, it's always uh there's so many unknowns to it, and that is okay.
mhm,
Um, but I would say that my mental health journey started way back in childhood.
mhm,
um,
mhm,
my background is really rooted in sort of a contrasting, even polarizing upbringing.
mhm,
I'm
mhm,
biracial.
mhm,
Both my parents are immigrants,
mhm,
and English as a second or third language. I think for my dad, it was like his sixth language.
mhm,
um,
mhm, mhm,
and the thing that they both had in common, and they were both from very different parts of the world,
mhm,
was that they both grew up in war and intense poverty.
mhm,
Um, but they both also had the value that, like, education was everything.
mhm,
um, and kind of the answer to all things. And so, unfortunately, that also meant that they never talked about the past. You weren't allowed to ask about it.
mhm,
Um, my mom, was a refugee from Vietnam.
mhm,
And she was a single mother fleeing, with
mhm,
two small children, and we weren't allowed to ask about, like, who their fathers were, all that.
mhm,
It was, everything was in the past, and you weren't allowed to talk about it. And my
mhm,
father, he was
mhm,
14 when World War II ended. So in Denmark, and so he some pretty formative years. My history, but I had history lessons in America, so they're a little, like, a little shaky.
right.
Um, I guess I could Google that. But however many years, he definitely had a lot. His formative years basically were under Nazi
Mhm,
occupation and the war, and
mhm,
so he served his required time in the Danish army, and basically
mhm,
left, and then he joined the U.S. Army to naturalize his citizenship.
mhm,
Um, and he kind of just bounced all over, was going to move to Australia. He was a single man until he was about 46.
mhm, mhm,
And, my parents met, and, like, in a week got married. Like, my mom was in the refugee camp basically, and
mhm,
she was a journalist in Vietnam, and she wrote her story, and he read it,
mhm,
and they just, like, in a week, he didn't even have a car. He had to borrow a car, and he
mhm,
goes to the refugee camp and picks her up for a date, and they end up getting married in Carson City, Nevada, like a week later. Like, and then I
mhm.
came along quickly afterwards, but nobody talked about that. And I was like, if you do the math, that was intense, you know. And he went to architecture school. So when he landed a job with the Corps of Engineers, and then worked for the first for 26 years after that. But we couldn't talk about anything personal, like,
Mhm,
but everything and I just remember my lens as a kid just being so sensitive and so heightenedly aware of just avoidance and rage, and kind of like masterful ways of, hyper intellectualizing what's actually happening. And, a lot of
mhm,
people call it gaslighting these days. And I don't want to, like, um I don't want to, like, say that people aren't, but I think that trauma is so prevalent in our culture and in our
mhm,
lives, that we don't realize that that's just a survival. Sometimes people survive by intellectualizing or saying something didn't happen or
Mm-hmm.
blaming someone else. So I was kind of like always watching that, like that lack of trust and sort of this isolation thing that they would do,
Mm-hmm.
night
Mm-hmm.
terrors, all that stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
like as a kid, as a very small kid, I remember feeling these
Mm-hmm.
things and really noticing and feeling what my friends' families were going through. I just kind of was a very I don't know, the whole world seemed very detailed to me, I guess. And my siblings also had their own, my sister was a writer and she would just spend days inside just writing and writing and writing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think like even back then I kind of noticed something like this very emotional, acute aspect of myself. But these two dialectics in my life,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
my father from Denmark and my mother, from Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
there was also the cultural aspects, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
well, and as you know,
Mm-hmm.
I really wish sometimes I get on these soapboxes where I'm like, we need a way of just like languages for people and for making mental health so much more like I love what you're doing, like making it inclusive, but it
Mm-hmm.
really is like, applicable and the language that's used, because in the Asian culture, like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
anything that is kind of like not the norm, especially mental health, is
Mm-hmm.
like they try to make it go away by shaming.
Right. Right.
If I
Right.
shame you enough, maybe you'll be okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and it's there's yeah, we could talk a ton about that. Like we could probably have
I totally get where you're coming from, right? I mean, like I haven't shared this before, but my mom and dad, they didn't have the kind of relationship that your mom and dad had. But the thing was like basically that's the same way it happened, wherein like my mom's family invited my dad's family over, and they just met, and then they got married within no time. So it may not have been the refugee camp based story, but the experience was pretty similar. And the other aspect that I also want to mention is like we don't talk about it because that is expected, that is an accepted form of engagement, and
Mhm.
people thought it was more of a responsibility to sort of behave that way. And marriage is just another phase of life that you get involved in, and you just move on. And this is something that you have to do. It's not a choice, it's not a decision that you get to make. It is something that people do, and because everybody else is doing it, that is your sort of prerogative to be doing this as well. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. And
I'm
the
so
other
glad you shared that. Yeah,
um
yeah.
and the
Arranged
other
marriages and
the other aspect that I sort of wanted to bring up was that
Mhm.
there is always this sense of struggle of identity, right? And you brought this up so clearly when you said, hey, where do I belong? And you said I have a dialectical approach with respect to my own identity is sort of split between am I Vietnamese or am I Danish, or Dutch rather, based on my own sort of individuality. But yeah, I mean, like those were sort of great points. you know I, I I want to sort of dig a little deeper there. Like I want to
Mhm.
understand, what does it mean when you say you're biracial, right? I mean, like, how do you define being biracial, and what does that mean to you? So.
It's interesting, Sanjay, because my parents grew like they moved to the mountains. Basically, they moved to the foothills into a really small town, Coloma, California.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's kind of like if you've gone to the bathroom in Placerville on the way to Tahoe, you might,
Hmm.
or if you've gone
Hmm.
rafting, right? Like whatever. But it was a really, really, really small back in the day. A lot more people go there now. But I think being, I say biracial because it's just kind of like neither neither place made sense. And I kind of I really wanted to seek that out at some point because I knew so little about my parents. So I moved to Denmark when I was 16. But I think being biracial gives me this opportunity to kind of see the world in just an additional lens, I guess. But I also I'm American. You know, I grew up in the United States. I grew up in California. I served in the military. I served 2 years of domestic Peace Corps here in the United States, you know, for 2 years. And so you do like, you know, county mental health, and you do, you know, work on Indian reservations. And it's really, which I really feel like I felt really welcomed on Indian reservations, and like in Hawaii, kind of where like I never really felt very welcomed in either my Vietnamese side. I don't speak the language. A lot of times when I was younger, my cousins would jokingly call me a half-breed, which is really sordid history in Vietnam, because during the war, you know, the GIs left a lot of children with a lot of Vietnamese women, and these half-breed children were actually thrown out like on the street. They were not allowed to get educated. They were called dust children in Vietnamese. Like my mom has translated it for me before. And so the American government kind of put together this program because there's thousands and thousands of them in Vietnam, and they're not allowed to work. They're not allowed. That's a whole thing, right? It's and we can talk about India too, right? Like there's so many things, and then we come with those ideas into America, and it's supposed to be this great melting pot. But I guess going back to our original thing that we were talking about is that, you know, as a therapist, I have all these things, these lenses. Right? Everybody that you come in contact with has different experiences. They have, and we are made up of all of our experiences. We have to understand them or integrate them, or at least leave them and be like, well, this is part of my, you know. So biracial is interesting because I just recently started using that in a way. But growing up, I remember, you know, watching American movies, and I remember asking my dad if I could go to prom. And he was, what is that? You know, like, what is this prom? And so we watched like some 80s movie or something. I'm like, that's prom. And he goes, that looks terrible. You know, I was like, he's like, I grew up during Nazi occupied war. Like, what is that? And I'm just kind of like, I guess I'm not going to prom. You know, like it was one of those, like, he was like, that looks so stupid.
Yeah. You know, I totally get what you're saying. And like me being a first generation immigrant, sometimes identity is a big question, because when you're young enough before you come here, you don't think enough about your own identity, where you belong, and you come to a different place and people don't accept you, for sure. You know, you can see it in the expression, you can see it in the way they talk about you, you can see in the conversations that you have. People are nice enough to have a friendly conversation, but you know, they won't sort of let you in, or you know, they won't make you feel like you are, you know, one with the community. But yeah, I mean, like a great point about prom. Like, you know, there's so many other things as well, right? I mean, like dating, and like, you know, in terms of assimilation, it is such a huge problem that, you know, people who move here have to understand and sort of figure out on their own. You know, I know you mentioned the military aspect. You know, I haven't, you know, had a chance to interact with a lot of people with that lens. So can you give me shed a little more light, you know, from that perspective? What's been your experience, and like, you know, how mental health plays along with it as well? So
Absolutely. So identity is interesting because my dad, being 3 branches of the military, that was part of his identity and kind of something that he always really pushed. And so we didn't have money for college. And so I was always kind of told my whole life, like, you should do the military, do the military, do the military. And so I did. I tried actually when I was about 18 to go into the Army, and the recruiter was a so inappropriate. And I at 17, I was like, I will be eaten alive
Mm-hmm.
if I do this. So I didn't, and my dad kicked me out. And so
Mm-hmm.
I actually moved in with my older brother down in San Diego, where our Vietnamese side of the family is, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I found different ways to pay for college. But when I finally did get done with my bachelor's degree after I did the domestic peace corps, I feel like my whole life has been like working to go to school.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I I later wanted to really go to grad school and go to nursing school, and the
Mm-hmm.
military had great scholarships, and so I revisited that just a little bit later in my earlier 20s
Mm-hmm.
and ended up joining the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And and that's and I find myself like even in this conversation like trying to avoid it, right? Because it's still something like even that I'm working on. And so it's one of those things as a therapist, I I refer those out, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm still doing the work on the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that went down
Mm-hmm.
in the military.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I mean, all in all, like again, I look at things very dialectically. Like there were so many things that I loved about the military, mainly like the gym, and you don't have to wait in line as a woman, as a woman, because there's less women. You don't have to like, there's not as many lines for the bathroom.
Right.
Like the
Right.
the locker
Mm-hmm.
room's empty. Um, but but in reality, like joking aside, like there the military is a great opportunity, and it's also really dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just dangerous for women, it's dangerous for men.
Mm-hmm.
And on different levels. And then it's also there's this other dialectic side to it where it's really boring and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And for
Mm-hmm.
all the times that you're you
Mm-hmm.
know getting to do something exciting, you're also sitting in hours of briefs and waiting for stuff that you don't know what's happening, and you're sweeping rocks and I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
dusting things. It's it's such an extreme. It's a very polarized environment,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also extremely diversified, like, which is one of the things I really love about it. It's really interesting that people come from all over, and people come from different places in the world, and they serve in
Mm-hmm.
the military.
Mm-hmm.
Natural, like my dad, he naturalized his citizenship. Sometimes people don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's, I guess the thing, so ground me in your question. How does that apply to my mental health?
So yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to get you into perspective, and I love your tangents. I love the way you're sort of talking about a lot of different aspects that go with it. But I think there is a lot of struggle in terms of asking for help. In terms of, this is nothing to do with the military, but it is in general as well. But, I just wanted to ask you from your perspective, like, how is sort of mental health being impacted to people specifically in, from the military lens, and, how we can sort of highlight and showcase, some of the problems that come with it as well. So,
Okay, absolutely. So the military is like a dysfunctional family.
hmm hmm
um, and so when people sometimes feel really like they hate it when they're there, but then there's something so familiar about it, and then they miss it when they're not there. And so
hmm
you create really strong friendships and bonds. And then
hmm
there's also a bonding over the things that really suck about it.
hmm
Um, and I'll just take a super deep dive into a thing that Americans don't like to think about is the amount of sexual assaults that are in the military.
hmm
And part of my own journey as a therapist was when I started working with veterans at at a homeless residential program. It was like a dual diagnosis, and I was
hmm
finding that a lot of the men that I was doing individual therapy with, like I always knew as a woman and somebody that experienced um, some traumas in the military that
hmm
you know it like I knew that that was a given. It's almost like you can almost count the women that haven't been,
hmm
but the amount of men that have is so underreported and so hidden and so silenced and so shameful for the world or the society to even want to think about. So these men suffer in great silence and oftentimes, you know, resort to substance abuse,
Mm-hmm.
and crime or whatever, homeless. There's a lot of broken relationships. It's hard to keep jobs. There's a lot of symptomology that goes with being sexually assaulted in a place where it's your family almost.
Mm-hmm.
The military is a family to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So the trust, the safety, the control, the power, all that stuff comes into play. It affects everything. It affects your ability to be intimate. It affects your ability to function, you know, and it usually, I mean, it really broke my heart, basically, that there's such a large portion of men who don't have a voice,
Mm-hmm.
and women too, right? But like here we'll just specifically talk about that. Like you add, you know, a lot of other factors and PTSD and combat
Mm-hmm.
and all
Mm-hmm.
that, and deployments and constant moving and broken marriages. I mean, marriages don't, you know, there's a lot of ruined marriages in the military. It's really hard to keep a relationship going when you're just all over the place and
Mm-hmm.
having to, your work comes first, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, that was something that really kind of made me stop in my tracks and switch direction in the work that I was doing, because I
Mm-hmm.
realized that even though I wanted to really be doing this work with these male veterans,
Mm-hmm.
I had my own shit basically that I
Mm-hmm.
needed to address. And it's not ethical as a therapist to continue working with people if I haven't done my own work around that same area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I stepped away from a lead clinician position,
Mm-hmm.
and it was really hard to leave working with these vets, because it was really like I had a lot of free therapeutic reign where we did Tai Chi, you know, like I had these huge groups that are seeing lots of clients a day, but at the same time we'd take walks and, like, you know, just do art. We had cats there because I think people just dropped off cats at the facility. We were doing gardening, like we were just kind of like getting really creative, but a lot of my own stuff came up and it really derailed my personal life. Like I divorced my son's dad, who
Mm-hmm.
was an ex-Marine who had just gotten out of the Marine Corps after 26 years. I moved out. I was all over the place. Like I really kind of had my own mental health crisis at the same
Mm-hmm.
time
Mm-hmm.
without any awareness of it, actually. Like I was really kind of like, it all seemed fine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, so it's really interesting that situation and that stressor, and plus we had just moved back from Japan.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been working for UCLA out there, and you know, I kind of just dove deep into this community of male veterans who so
Mm-hmm.
many of them had also and what I want to really highlight too is that, like, I wish I could just like pound this into people's head about, like, that sexual assault is about power and control. It's not
Mm-hmm.
about sexuality. And I think a large thing that come up for men is that questioning of their sexuality, and it's
Mm-hmm.
about power and control. It's pathology. It is sickness for somebody to violate another person like that,
Mm-hmm.
regardless. But it permeates into all areas: your intimacy, your ability to trust people, safety, everything. And so
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so I stepped away because I needed to take a look at that, and that journey actually still continues
Mm-hmm.
to this day, Sanjay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I just want to take a few seconds of silence, right? I mean, I don't know. I've seen people come here and talk about loss, and I said, you know what? Let's just take a few seconds of silence for one to acknowledge what has happened, and to acknowledge the pain and the suffering that comes with it. And at the same time, now I realize, I just want to acknowledge and just say, we're just holding space to all those people who don't get a chance to voice what happened, who don't get a chance to acknowledge that it happened, and who are still sort of dealing with this sense of power and control taken away from them. And uh, I know comparison is not a linear thing, and we can't compare experiences. But one thing I definitely wanted to share is, like, people who are immigrants here sometimes feel the same way. It's the sense of loss of power, the sense of loss of control, this a
Mm.
sense of loss of ability to sort of define your own lifestyle, and your lifestyle sort of taken away, and not knowing what it means to be a human being anymore. So
Oh,
just wanted to add that.
yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that as well.
I
um
really love that you said that, Sanjay, because I every day, the neighborhood that my son and I live, we moved close to my mom because she's 80, so we can, be close to her. And we are in a neighborhood where she moved to, and
mhm,
there's a lot of Afghani refugees here,
mhm,
and Ukrainian refugees from the war.
mhm,
And every day I go to the store, and I'm this is one of those things that makes me a great therapist, but also makes life sometimes really hard. But I just feel like I'll be there filling up my water next to a
mhm,
family, an Afghani family, and I'm just like, who were you? Like, what did you have to
mhm,
leave behind? Like, these are professionals, these are people that had lives, they had homes, and they had villages and families, and everybody was interconnected. And you
mhm,
could just see it in their eyes as they're walking around the grocery store, like this, that there's people are so much more than
mhm, mhm,
we always have to be willing to see that. I see that in homeless people too. It's just like, that is somebody's family, that is someone's child, that is somebody's person. Like, they have a story. And I think
mhm,
that it's so important that we take that time to know that people people are they deserve empathy.
mhm.
Everybody does, and animals do too. um, but yeah, it's huge. I see it every day where I live, and yeah, I just want to say that.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting that as well. One thing I wanted to ask you as well. So, I know people go into therapy and hope, or, like, work towards improving. But,
Mhm.
like, I want to get your perspective from a therapist standpoint. What happens when, like, people come in, and, like, what are some of your struggles when you have to talk to people, and, like, what, some of the things where you say, hey, even though I know I can say certain things, I have to hold back, and, like, just wanted to get your lens on those conversations. Yeah.
Okay. I gosh, it's funny because this kind of circles around to my therapist too, because we talk about this. But I oftentimes use the metaphor of, like, we're in a boat, we're in a boat together. And a lot of people use this sort of metaphor. But I think the most challenging thing is when people they want a certain technique, um, and they say nothing's working, like, I am not getting better, and you're a terrible therapist.
Hmm.
you know
Hmm.
they're not doing anything
Hmm.
in the other hours other than the 1 hour I see them. And it's really disheartening and hard, because I know how much work goes into my own mental health, right? And
Hmm.
into the idea of accepting things that we don't want to accept. Like, I have, a lot of times people are like, I have all this anxiety and I don't want to have any of it. Like, you haven't done anything for me. Like, you suck. Um, and, it's interesting because my own therapist, what I really like about, and I've gone through a lot of my own therapists, like a lot of times they've had to leave for their own personal, reasons, or moved, or, it's really difficult to find consistent mental health. It really is. And my heart goes out to everyone. And I know that there's, sliding scale for people is not always what's affordable. Sometimes $30 a month even is a lot for some
is a lot of money. Yeah.
Yeah, like people are struggling. But it's really difficult because if you're in a boat with your client as the therapist and they're like, hey, you need to tell me where I'm going. Like, you're the navigator, you're paddling, you're doing all the work, but they're just like, we're not getting anywhere. It's that shouldn't be what you're doing as a therapist. It kind of always reminds me of fire squads in the military, when we're I kind of have like a little bit of an obsession about land navigation and maps. I just like them. They're just kind of like my geek fest. I like to look at maps. But everybody has a job, right? When you're in a fire squad in the military, everybody's supposed to, you have your medical support, you have your point person, you have your navigator, you have these roles. And you can't do all of them. And I would always, that's I think from my upbringing, because I was very much like very close to my dad, and my dad had a very intense, I was always kind of like mitigating and navigating and trying to figure out what my dad was, going to do next or whatever. It turns out he was a bit, not only PTSD, but bipolar in there, a spectrum, which made it super interesting, extremely over functioning, sometimes not needing sleep. My tendency is to take everything on, right? Like, I'm just like, I'll just do everything, and sometimes in the military where I was just like, I'll just do that and I'll do this too. And then, you're just trying to, it's insanity. We need to work together. And so in therapy, that's huge. Like, that 1 hour, and I know clients are always just like, my therapist just tells me to journal. It's as simple as like waking up at the same time every day. It's as simple as like taking a walk, even if you don't feel like it, like having the routine of knowing what you're like, eating some food and keeping your blood sugar up. And it's like really small things that add up to great progress in the long run. And so that is one of the most difficult things, is when, you're paddling and you're trying to do, and you're like, just pick up the paddle, so that's hard. But I think that a lot of times those individuals will just drop out because nothing's happening for them. And that's okay, because sometimes people aren't in that place. That's okay. And it's also okay to find other therapists that might be a better fit, or organize your life differently so it fits in and you're not just like stressed when you come in to your session. Like, it's hard to find the way that works for people,
Right. I just caught on to one thing that you mentioned in terms of maps and journeys. So I know you had an interesting perspective on the maps and the journeys. Can you talk a little bit about like what those are? And it was very fascinating to me, and I would love for other people to hear about it as well. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm a very like visual kinesthetic. Like, I like to draw things out. So my metaphor is basically, because I love maps so much, and you could kind of draw this out yourself. So this is kind of something that's helpful, is that we are all made up of a bunch of rivers. So if you like picture it, that we have these different rivers that flow into what would ideally be our ocean, right? And each of the rivers go through vast landscapes. And so some are flowing, like some are wound up, some are super tied up, some are like totally polluted with like dead fish. Some just come and they like get stuck in giant reservoirs and they sit there. Some we don't even know where they started,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and many have changed course or been rerouted or, those sort of things. But if we think of ourselves as like a map and we have these
Mm-hmm.
rivers flow in, which is like, our family of origin, and it might be like, where we grew up, like how we identify ourselves, it's like the LGBTQ, or are we like biracial? Our relationships, our mental health stuff, the things that we identify as careers, all these rivers kind of flowing in and what they look like.
Mm-hmm.
And that I just kind of picture and see it that like we don't need to judge others on what their
Mm-hmm.
landscape looks like. And there
Mm-hmm.
is no GPS, there is no magic formula, but
Mm-hmm.
we just have to get curious. Like we have to
Mm-hmm.
get lost in order to be found. That sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Yeah, I mean that's just fascinating because sometimes I feel like you're going in one way and stuff happens to you and you just get rerouted. And and that is something that was really fascinating to me because you have all these goals, you have these visions, but what happens when things happen to you, and like do you still look at the same goals the same way, or do you sort of think about it as though there is a reason why this happened to me, and there is a reason why this sort of is sort of guiding me to tell me that, hey, you know what, this is going to be your journey now, and this is how you're sort of navigating along the way. So
Absolutely. I also like the idea of, Sanjay, about the Japanese kintsugi pots,
mhm,
the art form where it's like broken pottery, and instead of repairing the broken pot, you kind of mend it together with like liquid gold. And
mhm,
so the idea is allowing our wounds or our broken parts to be basically incorporated into who we are, and that those
mhm,
end up being like our strongest points.
mhm, mhm,
And not everybody's going to think that that's beautiful. That's okay. Our imperfections and our mistakes and our traumas and our unwanted parts can still be,
mhm,
incorporated and make us stronger. It
mhm.
it's hard. It takes process. Sometimes the parts don't want to fit together, and maybe there's a little missing part from it, but yeah. I always like that analogy.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, as in, like, rather than using something and throwing it away, even
Yeah.
if certain things are I don't know if broken is the right term, but if things have developed some flaws, maybe
Mhm.
then you're trying to mend those flaws and make it so that you are using it for the longer term as well. So yeah, and that the other thing that you mentioned, and this is not something which is new, but the trends where men and women sort of working together, it is such a challenge today, and we are becoming more and more divided as we go. So, like, can you share a little perspective into like how we can sort of collaborate or work together better, rather than the way people are sort of moving further and further away from each other as well, and how that is sort of impacting everybody's mental health as well. So
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think for your viewers, obviously, you and I have had more conversation and more details kind of behind the scenes. So a little bit on that is that I think I guess it's one of my passions is to acknowledge how, when we receive a trauma or receive I don't know, that's the wrong terminology, is that when we're hurt, our tendency is to generalize and then to include everyone in that category. And so what I
hmm
see, if we're thinking about, you know, heterosexual relationships, let's just start there, right? Like that,
hmm
you know, a woman is hurt by a man or a man is hurt by a woman, and the tendency is to blame all men or all women
hmm
is really, 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 really need to get away from that.
hmm
really challenge that narrative for so many reasons. For me personally, my own like PTSD and trauma experience compels me to challenge that narrative. And my therapist at the vet center is an ex-Marine, and he's off. Because we have the same language. There's a lot of things with that, and he's awesome because he helps me challenge, obviously, the thing that I'm afraid of, right? Like the thing that, I avoid in my personal life, which is, there's a lot of things that, like, although I have male, friends, I also keep people at a distance. Like my own trauma has really spelt, sort of distance in my own personal relationships. But I'm also a single mom of a boy. Right. My teenage son is my anchor. He is, and what I mean by that, and that's not like an enmeshment thing, but he's a reminder. He's more like, he is sort of like if you were to imagine the topographic map and there being like a beacon on the side of the ocean, he's one of those lighthouses that I'm like, oh, like this is why I'm doing this. This is why I'm doing my work. This is why because I want him in therapy. And I want him to have the emotional language that I didn't have when I was growing up, so that he has more tools and he understands, like, I'm narrating to him, like, when this comes up, this is what I feel, so that he has that ability to also navigate his own emotions, because it's a bunch of bullshit that men don't have emotions, right? Like, I still think that men are just supposed to be strong and deal with all the pressure and take care of things. And I know things are changing, but there's a reason why there's such a huge suicide rate among men. And they are the most, successful at it. And then you look at the veteran community and it's like over 20 something a day, I mean, it's really an issue that men don't have the same, social rights to share their feelings, but they don't have the language. And I think we have to really, really, really address that. And yeah, that's kind of.
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, definitely, I agree with everything that you said, of having that support system, finding that support system or finding your voice had been my struggle as well. I mean, I've done better now. Like if wherever I've navigated, I feel like I've, reach out to more people and figure out who, will be my part of the mental health team almost, wherein they can weather the storm as it comes, and it sort of guides me along the way. So yeah, Nina, I mean, like, this conversation has been great. It's just one thing that I want to sort of add to sort of bring in that inclusivity aspect. Like, what are some things that you do when you feel that sense of anxiousness or nervousness, or like, you're just getting sort of overwhelmed and don't know sort of what to do with all of that's coming up? So any guidance on that will be greatly helpful. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it's kind of, something that I also found over this mental health journey of my own is that but I was also diagnosed with the bipolar spectrum. So, and when I say that, people usually, their eyeballs are like, what? Like, because everybody kind of has an association, there's a lot of lack of information, and we also utilize that word improperly. But it's something that helps with that. And it's something that I just had my son and I talk about this a lot, because there are some genetic components to it. Is that there's a difference between our mood and what we feel, and then what we think. And so then also what our body is telling us. And the concept is like interoception, like our ability to like go in and notice what our bodies are feeling and doing. And so it really is mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
That term I found when I worked with a lot of veterans was a turnoff. It's sort of like telling them we're going to go do yoga. So I was like, we're going to go do martial arts. And they're like, cool. And I said, like, we're going to go do yoga, even though like you and I have had this conversation that before, yoga became like Lulu, whatever.
Right.
I'm not hating on that, but I'm just saying like,
Right.
it was intense. It's intense. It's just like getting into your body and really breathing and that.
Of course.
But language is really important. Is kind of my point. And so to me, even like the term mindfulness is so overused, but I use the term double down. So I stop and I pause and I realize when I'm reacting to something or something's coming up when somebody is, acting a certain way or whatever. It's our internal landscape dictates so much of how we perceive a situation. So I just double down. I kind of double down on myself and I ask myself kind of what's going on. And what I really want to notice is what is my mood and what am I feeling? Because those two things are different. So my son and I were talking about this. I'm like, a mood is almost like a weather pattern. Like you don't have control of that. Like it's some people's moods are pretty like steady, like weather every day. Other people's moods are kind of melancholy. It's sort of like Portland or not Portland, like sometimes it's just happy all the time. You're just like, okay. Portland isn't. They do have a hot summer. But so our mood is more like a weather pattern. And then there's feeling. And our feelings are like waves. Our feelings come in and they go out because feelings really can only last for about 20 seconds. But sometimes we start thinking about our feeling and then our feeling feels like it's lasting forever and ever and ever. And these things are all interconnected. But if I can double down on myself and ask myself, what is my mood? What's my weather right now? What am I feeling? And then I kind of just notice like if the thoughts, because sometimes you have running thoughts. And so I look at thoughts as just kind of like noise often. And then you could decide what you need to do. Like, do you need to go on a run? Do you need to go take a walk? Do you need to go like lay in water? Do you need to go take a nap? Do you need to eat some food? Do you need to drink some water? Like these are things that we can do for ourselves. I think we're such an externally focused society. We're often like, I feel like shit, so I'm going to watch 2 hours of Instagram or whatever. So, that's
Definitely.
what we tend to do. Or I'm going to just drink right now. Or, I'm going to like try to like smoke some weed and numb out, So it's like, it's just, and I'm not judging any of that stuff. Like, I think that on a spectrum, people choose what they choose and that's okay if it works for them. But that's what I do. I do that.
Right.
I double down.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And and the last thing is like I ask people like few things you want people to take away from this conversation, just the high notes. What would they be?
That it's a full moon and that I don't sleep during the full moon and I tend to like go on tangents. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know, that it's like that it's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to take the time that you need. And that there is help out there and it doesn't have to cost either. I really love like the groups that are on NAMI or like I think everybody could utilize a Codependence Anonymous group. I think that DSBA, which is like, for bipolar and depression, support groups are free also. And there's BPD groups and, ADHD. I think knowledge is power. And it's good to be curious. It's good to pull out the map and be like, okay, so what's going on here? Like what happens in this river? Like, I could use some more flow here. What do I need? I think the takeaway is that we're just human and have some empathy for yourself and some self-compassion. And that helps us see that everyone else is also fighting a battle too.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sometimes, I've just been feeling so overwhelmed during the conversations that I'm having off late. It's because I don't know. Sometimes I don't know if language is enough, right? I mean, sometimes I feel like words aren't enough to appreciate people for taking the courage to be as vulnerable as they are being, as you are being. Yeah, I just want to say thank you, and I hope some people, are urged to ask for help, or like feel that need to say, hey, you know what, this is not right. Something is not okay, and maybe it is okay for me to go and ask for help as well. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to, I don't know, and to not feel so alone in those. I guess there's something I do want to say about, like suicidality. Like it
Mm-hmm,
really does sometimes only seem like the only answer for so many people. And it's a really big area. I've been touched by suicide a lot in my own life. And have had my own struggles with it as well. And that people fear that, there's so much but when we talk about it, shame is one of those things that, like, anything that we feel shameful about, if we're
mm-hmm,
willing to put a little light on it, it it
mm-hmm,
it doesn't survive.
mm-hmm,
It
for sure.
lessens it. And so, I mean, just sitting with somebody and not trying to fix a situation, but
Mm-hmm,
that in and of itself can move us through it. So,
definitely. I
yeah,
hope people take that away too. So
absolutely, Sanjay.
yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you.
This has been awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.